What is going on, Hot Take Nation? It is DRW here for another episode of the Hot Take of the Day podcast. And I think if you've read me for any period of time, you know that one of my other passions incremental to the oil and gas industry and controversy is education. And part of it, I mean, my mother was a principal. I don't know if most people knew that before she went to be the president of United Way in Calgary for 15 years. And so education's been close to my heart. I was a public school educated kid, as was my sister. And growing up, thinking about university, thinking about options, I got recruited to go play at Princeton and Trinity College in Hartford for squash. And I elected not to go because it was extraordinarily expensive. And so I remember going to the University of Calgary for my engineering degree. And I think my tuition for the full year was $3,000 a year, and I might be high. And I think that if you were on the honor roll as a kid in high school for each of your 3 years, you got $1,500 a year for 4 years to go. So I effectively didn't pay for college for all intents and purposes. And at the time, an Ivy League education at Princeton was about $30,000 a year. Now I think the number is closer to $70,000 or $75,000 a year. So with the pandemic and with education being in question, MBAs, what should I do, job market, etc. I wanted to have someone on that I was introduced to formally through this. But Bob Ault invited me to come down and talk in Oklahoma City. What was it, like back when you could travel? I can't even believe it was like 2-3 months ago, Bob.
It was the first or second week of February. So it was right there on the initial cusp of the broader discussion just initially starting on COVID.
And so we were chatting, and one of the interesting things, so obviously Bob's in energy and he's going to introduce himself, but what was interesting was his connection to the education system. And I think a alternate universe career path had him as sort of an administrator in the public college system. So Bob, welcome to the Hot Take of the Day podcast. How are you doing? How are you holding up? I see the beard is a lot bigger than it was last time we saw.
Yeah. So I have my Rona beard, and it has come out in full force. You know, I've had the ability to work a little bit from home and remotely in this what I'm doing now, anyways. But being more relegated to social distance, it's allowed the opportunity to have the beard come out. You know, I don't have to do as many face-to-face with customers, and as such, I don't have to look as presentable. So,
now, do you have a plan? Do you have a beard shaving plan? Like, what is the milestone of the quarantine lockdown era where the beard will be taken down to a different level?
Yeah. I have not, other than the fact that this week has been the week that I've decided, like, maybe it needs to be rung in just a little bit. You know, it's getting up into the mid 90s, upper 90s in Oklahoma. When I'm out doing my morning run, it's a little much and a little warm.
I get it. Well, I've been very impressed to see the way Oklahoma has dealt, I think, with the coronavirus lockdown, and it is interesting because it does kind of divide on Democrat versus Republican lines, but
Sure.
But less so. I mean, a little bit because it's polarizing, and it has galvanized parties, but I think also because at the very core, the Democratic viewpoint and the Republican viewpoint sort of is a social collective well good versus individual freedoms. And so this sort of strikes at the core of that value set. And so where I wanted to start the conversation today on education was why don't you give a little bit of your background? I mean, obviously what you do in oil and gas now, just so listeners know and can get to know you, but your background with the college system and education.
Sure. So I did my undergrad at Oklahoma State University here in Oklahoma, which is probably the best university in the state, bar none.
Get the plug in.
Yeah, right. Go Pokes. But after I finished my undergrad, I got a job at an economics education firm in New England. Worked there for a few years and then moved to New York City and worked for the Princeton Review. and worked there for a couple of years and moved back to Oklahoma. And at that time, I transitioned directly into higher education, working at a university here in central Oklahoma City. Great institution, great people. From there, I transitioned to running an education foundation. And then at that point, kind of had an about face in my career. I started a family, got married, had my first kid, and decided maybe it was time for a change. And I'm sure we can get into some of those reasons here later on in the conversation. But in the interest of brevity, moved into oil and gas. That's the biggest industry here in Oklahoma City and Oklahoma in general. And now I've been doing that for about 7 years now, and loving every minute of it.
So I mean, we've talked about oil and gas in Oklahoma on the podcast a lot lately, and I've been on some webinars where I really talk about the spirit of Oklahoma and the way that state has responded to crisis in the past, and that I do see a wave of people moving there. Just because you have such a great education base, you have some great colleges, you have some great cities, it's relatively inexpensive to live. From a manufacturing standpoint, you can see it coming out, maybe not in the oil and gas space, but you can see people coming. And one of the draws to communities and states, obviously, is education. So, I mean, how do you think that higher education interplays with state politics and attractiveness to people for living there and setting up businesses there?
Well, I think there's a lot of variables in that equation. Cost of living is obviously a huge factor in terms of your employee base, and those are factors they take in consideration. But they also take in consideration other social variables. So access to good quality schools and good quality higher education institutions, the cost of those services, brand recognition, Carnegie classification program. If those institutions have great individual programs that have national recognition for whatever it is that they purport to do, and then is there a political an overall political aura around it that supports education in general or not? And are monies flowing to the institutions or are they not? And that interplay.
And so how do monies flow to education? I mean, we obviously see tuition, and that's the very public side. And let's not talk value proposition yet, but how does money flow to the various different institutions?
Well, so there are, 50 different states in the U.S. The U.S. funds education and higher education differently than many other parts of the world. In the U.S., each state, you're going to have private institutions, public institutions. You're going to have very specific programmatic institutions, like your, community colleges or vo-tech type institutions. And so each one of those have unique mechanisms for funding. When we say higher ed, in general, what people think of is state systems of higher education. So your state schools that are run by state systems, or they might think of the Ivy Leagues. But in general, that's what people are meaning when they say higher ed. And the constitutions of individual states generally set the parameters and the mechanisms through which funding occurs. And usually there's a board of regents that's set up through a state constitution who are in charge of the overall administrative oversight of your state systems. And then within those state systems, they kind of have a hierarchical breakdown of liberal arts schools versus land grant institutions. And then those individual institutions have a governing body that oversees administrative oversight for those institutions. Basically, you just work your way back up to state funding on the public side. So an individual institution will set what its budget needs are. They'll come up with those budget forecasts. They'll take those to their trustees. The trustees will take them to their governing body. And then regents, the overall regents will then propose that back to the legislature for public funding. And then obviously private institutions, funding is 100% based on do they have access. They might get some federal money or some state money based on grants or other things, research that they're doing, but obviously majority of that funding is going to come on the back of the endowments that those institutions have, or the students themselves in terms of tuition and fees.
So, I mean, it sounds incredibly complicated and incredibly bureaucratic. And just in the description of how schools get funded, I mean, it was insane. It was mind blowing. And so I think about, like, go for it. So first of all, I mean, it was one of the topics that you and I talked about was tuition has gone up so much, not just at the private school level, but certainly at the state school level. And there sounds like there's a lot of levels of bureaucracy, and then schools interplaying like what their specialities should be, how big classes should be. I mean, where are the challenges that education is going to come out of here, with remote learning and students maybe not going back because they don't want to go and remote learn. They're going to take a year off. What happens there?
The financial reality confronting higher education is not a good one. And a lot of institutions are going to be forced to close sooner rather than later. And this is just a byproduct of the natural progression higher education has had as an industry. For hundreds of years within the U.S., it's sort of had a monopoly on post-secondary education. That's where knowledge was held. The access to that knowledge was there, and that's where research and the move toward truth and meaning and research was held in that vacuum of higher education. As we've progressed through technology and other platforms, students and society at large has way more access to information. They're not relegated to just go to institution of higher learning to get access to that. So there's been a democratization from that access to information. And that presents some very real, longevity concerns for institutions as they lose their foothold there. And also just, we have lowered the barrier of entry to students to get access to schools, and no longer do they need to go to those bricks and mortar institutions. We've had a growth over the last 100 years, a huge growth of institutions and just in general, bricks and mortar institutions. There was intense with that. We had land-grant institutions pop up all over the U.S. and other institutions. So we just have an overproduction of higher education right now. And when you have an overproduction of something, consolidation just needs to happen. And unfortunately, in the past, the self-correcting mechanisms that would just be normal in a given market have not played out like they have in higher education, and now those things are actually taking hold, and you'll see a clean out within the industry.
So it's funny that, so supply demand economics over time does actually work. Oil and gas is not the only industry that has, when you have too much supply, there are issues. So one of the things that you and I talked about that I remember the conversation, because we spent quite a bit of time together, which was awesome. And you talked about the composition and makeup of tenure versus non-tenure, and then Democrat versus Republican. And on the one hand, we think, I'm going to use the word altruistic, although I'm probably using it incorrectly, but we have this sort of like utopian vision that education is educating our youth and challenging them and molding them and bringing them into very uncomfortable learnings. And then on the other hand, we have political biases in staff, or tenure versus non-tenure, or whatever, safe spaces at schools, where it seems like we've really watered down, and that now the degree sort of came a checkbox. What do you make of all that, and how would you
Sure. Yeah.
provide
So,
context?
so the political leanings that you find among individuals that work in higher education obviously skew to the left, and in relation to just the broader public. And there are a lot of factors for that. And regardless of what those factors are, the reality is that people that work in higher ed tend to skew more to the left than they are to the right. And so that creates an environment, especially when you're sending students there to explore what their future is going to be, and to test their level of understanding and just personal growth. Whenever you have the folks leading that charge obviously skewed to one direction, there can be unintended consequences for that. And I think some people are upset by that. And I would
Do
just...
you just jump in on that? Because do you think that the reason they're left leaning is because they are not sort of free market? Like when I think about a government employee, you're part of the social framework, and so you tend to go in to do that as like a career, whereas maybe someone who is more free market might be more Republican. Is that a fair characterization as to why it's left leaning?
Yeah, I would say that is one of the factors for sure. Personality types tend to move in different directions. Also, the individuals who work in highly skilled or highly educated professions also just tend to skew to a more left-leaning basis, just in general.
So like an urban versus rural, a little bit in that.
A little bit, yeah, but not necessarily. There'd be high correlation there, causation, maybe not. But the biggest the higher education institutions, the individuals who work there do lean left. You hear a lot about the faculty being the ones that are on the left versus potentially on the right, and that is true. But in reality, the largest portion and the ones who have the biggest impact on what I might consider some sort of indoctrination, although I don't think that there's like a malice in this, it's just what happens,
right,
is the growth of what are sort of the ancillary services that institutions now offer to students that in the past just weren't there. So some student services, deans of students, it's the ancillary programs and department offices that are student support services. Those departments and groups within higher ed, those individuals who work there are way off of the scale. You're talking, like a 12-to-1 ratio of left-leaning, but also they're just not on the left. They're way skewed on their policy views, so way more far left than even faculty. And those are the ones that are doing the day-to-day interactions with students, and they're coming up with the programs, student programs and offerings on campus. And so that's really where the disconnect is. And so regardless of what your leanings are, when you create a bubble, groupthink occurs. And also the further left you get, or the farther right you get, the more unlikely you are to even want to be exposed to thoughts or ideas or ways of believing that might run counter to your own. And I think that's sort of the backlash you see right now in higher education, as you get conservative speakers or others that want to come to campus. And instead of saying, yeah, let's do that, and I disagree with how the speaker's going to talk, and I'll let the students be exposed to it, and then I'll give them a rebuttal to whatever that message is. The tendency is to just shut it down and say, this is, these are threats to our students or whatever. And that's just not probably helpful. And it's, in my opinion, it's the antithesis of the purpose and meaning of higher education.
Do you think that it has been exacerbated by the social media? And I think about social media, and you tend to follow people with like views on a Twitter. I think LinkedIn is still it's just a different animal, but there's a lot less users. But it seems like they create this echo chamber, and it also comes to mind that what's that saying, that if you're not a Democrat when you're young, you're heartless, and if you're not a conservative when you're old, you're stupid, or something like that. Like so there's also that bias of like young people exploring tend to be more collective because they've had these collective educational experiences that then is exacerbated by left-leaning lower education teachers. And then is this a problem in your opinion, and is it one of the reasons that you left higher ed, or is it's just the way it is, and it's just a blind spot we have to be aware of?
It's a very real concern, and it needs to be addressed. And if institutions don't intentionally try to face it and recognize it as being an issue, and it's something that can be addressed and can be fixed, it's just, will institutions have the wherewithal to step up against something that usually gets the fighting goes on, and it gets very loud on the mediums that you suggest there, and those aren't necessarily representative of the general thought process. And so you get people that are calling presidents and a provost office, and they're screaming at the top of their lungs, and they're posting stuff all over Twitter and social media, and they're saying, hey, these people are fascists or whatever. And those, your natural reaction then is to try to address the concern that they're putting forward. But just how loud someone's protesting, or how loud someone is passionate about something, doesn't mean that, one, they have valid concerns, or two, you should meet them with the same amount of effort. And so institutions just need to take a little bit of a step back and be a little bit more objective in pandering to groups like that on the left or the right, and just say, hey, what's our mission? What's our role here? What's the best thing for our students? What's the best things for staff and faculty here? And let's be sensible in policies and procedures moving forward. And they just, you need to do things like that. And it's an issue. These things are issues, and they can be addressed. Will people have the wherewithal to do it is a different.
No. Remind me, was it the University of Chicago that sort of published a letter that I remember from about a year or two ago that sort of said, we don't have safe spaces on campus. There's no I can't remember exactly the wording, but it seems like some institutions are sort of addressing that, and that broadly one of the things that came to mind was, I'm not sure that Republican parents, and I'm not trying to say that Republican parents should raise Republican kids and vice versa, but half the population roughly, or 30%, is Republican registered, 30% is Democrat registered, 40% is independent. You have to think that some of these universities are going to cater to that more conservative, and was it the University of Chicago that had that letter?
I think it might have been. I can't remember exactly which one it is, but increasingly you're going to see folks from institutions saying, our job here is not to make you feel, the primary mission is not to make you feel comfortable and safe. It's to expose you to ideas, to broaden and expand, and make you learn how to be a good citizen. You'll see more institutions start catering in that direction, and because students are also going to demand more and more of that stuff. Student demands is another dimension that, usually does not get adequately addressed when we think about some of the problems in higher ed. We always talk about the rising costs of tuition and fees. And I liken this a lot to oil and gas, where people are always like, well, all these really terrible oil and gas companies keep raiding lands and, killing baby seals and all sorts of stuff. And you're like,
there's a lot of baby seals in the Permian, I've noticed.
Yeah, right. People don't understand, they're just producing a product that there's a demand for. And, majority of our, technology is is created in some way, shape, or form from chemicals extracted in oil and gas production. All of your plastics, everything that you experience in day-to-day life usually leads back in some way, shape, or form from oil and gas production. In higher ed, these institutions are just trying to cater to students and student demands. And so students are asking for, I want really good, sports programs, and I want the best new dorm room, and I want access to a great library, and I want that library to have a Starbucks in it, and all of these things. And so institutions have tried to kind of cater to those so that they can recruit students. And that's not necessarily going to play out well in the long run, because you've just created so many liabilities, unfunded liabilities in the future for these institutions, where they're just going to have to keep servicing the debt on, the build out of their services and their bricks and mortar facilities with student tuition that in the future might not be there. And it's going to be a real issue. But the overall customers are the ones that they're trying to chase to do this. And whenever you have an overproduction of education in the industry, when we have too many institutions providing all these services, and then they're spiraling to the bottom trying to chase students to come to their institution, this is going to be a really terrible thing.
Well, yeah, I mean, and so we haven't even talked about the value proposition, because I think about this a lot, and I did a post maybe a year ago. Maybe it wasn't quite then, but it was sort of on the 529 program, and
Sure.
we had our financial advisors run some models, and I said to my kids, where would you like to go to school? And of course, my younger son said, well, I want to go to Harvard, of course, and my older son said, well, I want to go to Michigan because I want to play hockey. Now, the fact that my older one now plays golf and doesn't play hockey, and my younger one wants to play hockey is like life changes. But they ran the model, and based on tuition inflation of around 7%, and given their ages that at the time were 14 and 12, they were sort of running a model that the before tax cost for me to send my kids to school for 4 years was $780,000 for those schools. Now, of course, there's different alternatives, but I'm just as like a placeholder. And I actually was so surprised I had to have them redo the math. Yeah. And then I started thinking, if that's 780 before or after tax dollars for me, that's like $1 million plus of earnings before tax, which is multitudes of years where 100% of my income goes to my kids' educations. And then I sort of got to thinking, well, if I just took $1 million and put it in a small business. Now, this was before the government convinced us that they could shut down any small business anytime, and that's probably a horrible investment. Yeah. But I mean, what do you think about the value proposition that the schools have had? And in this, not only does it need to consolidate, but it seems like, I paid $3,000 a year. I mean, my all-in cost was $12,000. I worked in the summers. Everything was paid for. That worked great. I can't imagine coming out with a $350,000 bill and trying to make a life. What do you think of all that?
Oh, it's a very real concern. And, you have to, students are increasingly breaking into two groups, and that is the ones that are desiring the traditional experience, and then those who are saying, I want to come in here and get exposure to very specific core sets of information that I want to take and for my career prep or whatever it is. And how you service those two types of students is very different. And institutions have historically had a desire to move up Carnegie classification type. And so, Harvard is sort of the pie in the sky. Everybody wants to be Harvard, and students want to go to Harvard. They can't really quite say exactly why, but we all know that Harvard's the cream of the crop, right?
Right.
Well, the incentive is for then all institutions to say, well, I'm Panhandle Southwestern Technical College of whatever state you want to say, and I'm gonna, we want to move up in Carnegie classification because we want to be Harvard, but there's no reason under the sun why they should try to emulate that institution. And all they do in that concert effort to become Harvard is lose the mission of the institution and just grow their cost basis for providing services, and you leave other students behind in areas that say, well, I'm going to your institution, I'm not going to Harvard. Stop trying to be like Harvard, just give me what I'm wanting from you. And there's a real disconnect from that, because if you work at an institution, obviously you want your institution to be prestigious, and because you want to be seen as working at a prestigious institution. So then maybe you alter your behaviors as a professor or a staff member, and all of those things create a disconnect between what a demand is versus what the institution just wants to be. And if you feel like you're a monopoly, then it doesn't matter if what you do. You just at the end of the day say, well, we're going to raise tuition and fees so that we can be like Harvard.
Well, and I'm getting to the age now where my friends have kids who are going to college. And so, I think COVID has been such an interesting lens put on our choices and our values and our decision making, because, the thing that by and large, the students who were in college and then had to come home and did the remote learning, they're like, the remote learning was fine, but I really miss the peers. I miss my friends. I miss the life. I miss living away. And then again, I come back to the things that you said. So students are wanting a library with a Starbucks, but all the content you could possibly want is here. I mean, you can watch podcasts for free. MIT offers free online courses.
Yep.
It just seems like the industry is so ripe for disruption, and yet it's so embedded in the political, based on the way you described it, the bureaucracy of funding, that to actually free market disrupt it, there seems like there's a lot of barriers to entry. And obviously some profit universities, Trump University comes to mind, fails. Yeah. Well, why do you think education hasn't been disrupted? And do you think that it now will be? It's just gonna happen?
Yeah, it has failed to be disrupted for a long time for a lot of reasons. It will be disrupted. There's a huge dilemma confronting the industry. COVID is just going to amplify the speed at which that destruction happens. And so, like I've mentioned earlier, just the historic perspective of higher education and what its mission is very different, because there's not necessarily a for-profit driver there. And so when there's not that for-profit driver, some of the market conditions aren't normally applied for disruption. So the Harvards and the Princetons and the Yales are going to weather this storm, and they've got the endowments to do it. Smaller institutions, regional institutions, private institutions, this is going to be a devastating blow post-COVID. Their endowments, if they have an endowment, took a shot just like everybody else's investments did. Personal net worth for individuals are down. So that's a double whammy. Students and parents are going to be way more selective on what they do moving forward with those dollars. You can't plug the holes with the allocations from the endowments moving forward to offset some of that revenue. Also, students are going to increasingly say, hey, if I don't have the learning outcomes or the experience that I want, I need some sort of compensation back. Obviously, there's lawsuits all over the U.S. right now where students are suing their institutions because the perception of the online stuff is not the same as what they were going to pay for, and they say, well, we need compensation back, or I couldn't access that Starbucks in my library, and so refund me my library fee, or whatever it is. And we can debate the merits of that or not. That's not the issue. The issue is there are revenue implications for those actions, and just most institutions on a moving forward basis are not going to be able to absorb those cost increases with the revenue shortfalls that are going to be there, and they're going to be forced to close. But the biggest thing to this is some students are going to say, hey, the online learning was fine. I'm going to continue to do these types of things. But The real disruption is going to be when the Harvards and the Yales and the Princetons say, hey, we didn't want to go down this route, but we had to go online. We can go online. And why would students then say, well, I don't have to necessarily go to Connecticut or to Massachusetts to get access to these premier brands? I can go online, and so why would I go to this regional institution over here with a no-name program when I can do the same online learning as I was forced to experience through this COVID process that I can now get through the best universities in the world? And students are going to increasingly choose that moving forward. And from a job perspective basis, whenever your HR managers and other people have gone through online programs, or maybe they've gone to an online university, the negative connotation associated with those online platforms or those for-profit institutions, those start going away when increasingly people in the professional world come from those types of institutions. So that stigma goes away, and more students are going to say, well, to get a good job I don't have to go to this institution. I don't have to be there as in person. And so some of that staying power, goes away. So these are very real concerns confronting institutions, and a lot of them are going to have to close their doors.
Well, and it's so funny because again, we talk about the wealth destruction of event of COVID, and yet
Sure.
The stock market, which is not the economy, but the stock market does well. And so it is interesting to me that I feel like a lot of people are not projecting. And maybe it's one of the things that university does learn. And so I think about, so for listeners who are still listening, because, again, attention spans are low. And I think that this is a really valuable point, is someone will tune in for a YouTube channel like we have, and they'll listen for 15 minutes and they say, well, that was, that was kind of interesting, but now I want to go and I'm going to go garden because I'm home or whatever. Sure. So there is an actual lack of productivity, I think, from online learning, because the lack of accountability is real. But then people think about it and they're like, well, I can learn and I can listen to people, and I can, that conversation around, do I really want my kids to go to college? And then if they didn't go to college, like, would I have an online school where I could get case studies from a prof that was filmed 7 years ago or whatever, and they're going to just put their class online and I can go at my own pace, and I'm going to supplement with this and this and this. I mean, it seems like even teaching is going to have to change, because there's so much content that you're trying to be relevant, and you're like, okay, what's the case study of data analysis, and why did COVID happen, and why was it wrong, and how do we study it? And I mean, it's mind-blowing how different this is going to be. Sure. Does it blow? It blows your mind?
It blows my mind in a little bit. I've me and dozens of other, hundreds, thousands of other people have known that this disruption in higher education is coming. It's just, our institution is going to be willing to deal with it, face it, moving forward or not. Online education has good things, and then there's bad things about it, and all of this is just simply a trade-off, and the students are the customers, so they're going to decide at what point the trade-off is worth it. Nothing is better than your face-to-face college interaction in a classroom with a good professor doing good quality pedagogical teaching, but at what cost does that become a trade-off that a student's willing to make, or parents willing to make, whenever that price point gets to a certain area where they're like, well, it doesn't matter if that's the better thing for your educational outcome. The debt you're going to go in is so high that we don't care what experience it is or how much you get out of it, you won't be able to offset the negative implications for your life moving forward, because you're going to be servicing your college debt for so far in your life. So you're not going to be able to take certain risks post education that you would have elsewhere. You won't be able to take a risk to go move to this city to take this really cool job that might have great opportunity in the future because, well, my debt payments on my stuff start immediately. So I just need to find a job, whatever job it is. And I can't leave that job for 15 years until my note's paid off. So there are very real implications, not just to students from what we're doing. There's broader implications across our economy. We will be less innovative as an economy because of the burdens we're placing on future workers. And, that's not a good thing.
Well, not to mention, like, that when we talk about burden on workers, is life expectancy since 1935, when they put Social Security in, has increased from 65 at the time to, I think maybe, it was 65 in 1935. Life expectancy was 61 in 1935. You didn't get Social Security until you were 65. Now, Social Security still kicks in at 65, but life expectancy is 80. So we've gone from 16 workers supporting each retiree to 3 workers supporting each retiree. And then all of the new students coming in are finding the job market is different and they have all these bills. So yeah, it's a great point on the burdens that we're putting on society. If you could wave a magic wand and go back into higher ed and run, we've been talking about Harvard, so you're running Harvard, but let's say you're doing that. What do you do to change it? Like what 3 actions would you take that you think would be a sustainable fix for the program? Let's start there.
Man, there are individuals so much smarter than me that have tried a lot of things with no avail. So that's hard to come up with 3 specific things that I would do. One thing that has to be done, and the stomach to do it just doesn't exist. And that's why people are always mad at university presidents and think that they're just these terrible people, is consolidation needs to happen, and that doesn't rest at the feet of university presidents themselves. That rests at the feet of state legislatures, regents, board of trustees. Those things, that needs to happen, and those hard conversations need to occur. The other thing is we have a big reason why none of these changes, substantive changes, are not occurring, and they're not occurring in a quick fashion, is we have shared governance structures across institutions. So we think of a university president. University presidents in America are very unlike any other collegiate leaders across the world. They're, over in Asia and Europe, Africa, the university presidents don't have near the power that they do in America. It's sort of more of a guild type structure. But even in America, university presidents are very much handcuffed in what actions that they can push top down on their institutions. Things have to go through faculty senates and all other areas of the bureaucracy, as you mentioned. And a lot of times, change is going to be fought because there's a lack of understanding of what the mission of higher education is. And so the trustees of an institution think we should do this. Faculty thinks we should do this. Students think we should do this. The community at which the institution sits, regionally thinks the institution's there as an economic boom for the region. And so the desires or the understandings of what the mission of that institution is literally can be different across those constituent bases. And somebody in all of them might be right in some way, shape, or form. And how do you service all of those things? And so we need more power given to some sort of leader. So that's one thing that I would do is we need to back off of some of the shared governance things, because the survival of institutions is literally there. And
in terms of it's structurally protected. I mean, and it's funny, as we've had this conversation, it really makes me think about the parallels to energy, which makes me think
Yeah.
about that the parallels must exist everywhere. But, you know, a university professor or a president has aspired for 25 years to be the president and now is the president, and they make 2, 3, 4, however many millions of dollars they do. They're at the peak of their career. They don't want to merge with another school, because then
Yeah.
half the teachers go away and half the
Yeah.
salaries go away and half the buildings go away. And all of that, you know, this hierarchy of how much money you make, there's wage compression there, and that's bad.
It's a very difficult thing. One, you know, my individual area of research was university presidents, and so people have this idea that university presidents just do whatever they want, and a lot of times they just can't do it from a structure standpoint. But what that actually leads to is the unintended consequence of this is the leaders who are supposed to be tackling tough decisions, they get into the office and they just try and hope to piss off the least amount of people as possible. Go build a couple buildings, because that's a lot of times that's how we make a decision on if a leader is doing something good or not. We want to see the physical results of them doing something. So we build buildings and increase the debt burden associated with future liabilities for that deal. And then we just go become a president at another institution to where then your clock starts over on you being evaluated on, are you making progress or not?
It sounds a lot like politics, in that you're trying to piss off the least a lot of people, build a couple buildings, and then get reelected.
Yeah, and it's not. There's no like ill intent. Those are the consequences of the system we've created. There are barriers from these leaders being able to do real things, and so as a result, they don't focus on substantive changes. Now, obviously, the variables confronting them now are way different than they've ever been before, and way more serious than they ever did before. So a lot of them are not going to be able to not focus on addressing some of these issues. But it's a real concern. And the other thing is these presidents rely on a board of trustees to help them. And these trustees are often government appointed individuals, and regardless of how talented they might be in their specific field or the tie that they might have to an institution, they're appointed positions, no compensation, and they're more honorific than they are in terms of substance. And a lot of times these people are responsible for one institution or a multitude of institutions. They spend 1 hour, 2 hours a month on governance for one institution, multiple institutions, and even then they recommend to the president, hey, we think we should do this, but they have no implications of the academic culture associated with shared governance. So are those policies even doable? How much wake are they going to leave behind them? And now contrast that against those same individuals and the efforts they put out on the actual corporate boards they serve on. And they're probably doing 10 times, 20 times as much actual work and time commitment. And even then they're having a hard time making the right decisions for the institution. So it's just, it's not real governance.
Well, I mean, and so I think about the next 5 years, and I think about the decision of my kid to go to college, and I wonder of the state versus private. Again, we talk about the connections that private universities might have, and then the question of wage gap and equality of opportunity. That the George Floyd riots are about that, but it's also about, like, society has failed a large group of people who are disenfranchised and young and don't have great jobs and might have high debt, have nowhere to go, and they're angry. And it feels to me like a private university where you can afford to pay $70,000 a year, the kid comes out and you've had, the most powerful leaders in America have spoken there, hire from there. It feels like that will crumble just from like a democratization of education. And then on top of that, state schools are cheaper. So how many people decide that they're going to stay in state? And then on top of that, we now have this where you can Zoom to work. And so does it matter if I'm living in, Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I
Sure.
happen to be in state for Michigan because that's where my kids want to
Sure.
go to school, and I can zoom back to Houston for my
Yeah.
oil and gas job. Like it feels like the depth of change that could come is beyond what society is prepared for, and that
Sure.
entire institutions won't just close, they will just collapse, and government will have to deal with this. And there's a lot of people on payroll that are going to be negatively influenced by it.
Yeah. 100%. They're yeah. The future of some of these institutions that are going to close is going to have huge implications on the workforces in those communities, the economic impact in those communities. But delaying them and just pretending that those situations aren't real is not going to lessen the impact of those closures, and you're not going to wish them away, and that's the exact same bubble confronting oil and gas at the moment, and a lot of these companies refuse to make the necessary decisions, and so you just, hey, we'll cut by 5% here and 5% there, and that's not the issue.
No,
The
I mean,
issue
it's right.
is
It's 100. The 5% doesn't do it. It needs to go away. And you know,
Mhm.
the last point I'll make is when we were in Oklahoma City, we went in the Devon building. A
Yeah,
lot of people have asked, where'd that picture come from? You're standing in the lobby, you're pointing at a building. And I think about the challenge that commercial real estate is facing just in general because of
yeah,
the potential zoom.
yeah,
Then I think about higher education, the cost of some of their older buildings. You could almost see where maybe universities could use office space downtown to offer new universities that are called the David and Bob,
sure,
education of higher learning.
yeah,
And you teach some courses, you have some online study, you have some interaction, you
yeah,
don't have a sports team.
yeah.
That feels like it could be the future of education.
Yeah, the metropolitan university type model is something that is emerging and will only continue to do so. And like you said, the access to commercial space downtown, where commuting for professionals or more professional development type work, post secondary, post undergraduate work, will hopefully expand in those areas. Um, you know, the one of the frustrations I always had working at institutions was we would continuously face budget cuts, and opposed to being strategic in how we applied those. Leadership would always seem to say, well, we're just going to evenly split these up. Everybody's going to take a certain percentage cut, and it's going to be non-discriminatory. So everybody just needs to figure out a way to cut this percentage. And that's great if what you were supposed to do was be democratic about the process and piss off the least amount of people. But whenever you're trying to save your institution and save the industry as whole, no one institution's 5% cut or whatever that percentage is addresses the underlying issue. And
Yeah, it kind of
hopefully,
reminds me of the GE model where Jack Welch used to say cut 10% of the staff every year, which worked for a couple of years. But then
yeah,
beyond that, they're like you hear stories about people who had passed away during the year, and they would be included on the list because you just needed to get your 10%. So it goes beyond the logic because you've
yeah,
defeated the purpose of
yeah,
rehabilitation. Well, Bob, I mean, I remember the conversation so vividly, and I think that just having people think about all the changes that are coming, because the worst kind of advice to me is the advice that people just they give over and over without thought. And
sure,
certainly we have told our children for 50 years, you have to go get a university education, because without a university education, doors will not open. But as the costs have risen, we haven't done a trade-off conversation, and we don't appear very good at trade-offs. And so, I'll close this podcast with a great thank you for, hopefully parents are listening on behalf of their kids and starting to say, is really, do I really want to give my kids $350,000 of debt? Or, do I want to set my kids up to go to the school they really want to go to? Or are they going to go to the school that gives the money to go there, in state, in a small town, where they can come out with the best balanced education and the best opportunity at the lowest cost? And so hopefully this conversation has sparked that. As always, you can write a review so that we can keep getting an expanded audience and people can understand the challenges of today. It's sort of like a free education, a free higher learning education hot take of the day. So Bob, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, DRW.
Until next time, be safe, be good, have a great day, and bye.